He stood before 5 of the most sought-after women in the territory and walked away from every single one. Dorian Vance didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just turned his back on silk dresses, dowry promises, and the furious stares of men who could ruin him with a single word. The whole town of Black Hollow held its breath. Then he crossed the street, stopped in front of a woman everyone had been laughing at for 3 days straight. She was heavy, poorly dressed, alone, and she didn't even look up when he approached. "You," he said quietly. "What's your name?" And that was the moment Black Hollow stopped breathing entirely. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Black Hollow, Wyoming Territory, October 3. The first hard frost came 3 weeks early that year. It crept in from the north sometime around midnight, silent and indifferent, glazing the wagon ruts on Main Street with a thin skin of ice and killing the last of the marigolds that old Hetty Prush had been nursing along her front fence since June. By dawn, the sky had turned the color of dirty pewter, and the men loading feed sacks at Grady's Supply were stamping their boots and pulling their collars up and saying the same thing they said every October: "This winter's going to be a bad one." They weren't wrong, but none of them could have predicted that the worst storm of the season wouldn't be the one coming down from the mountains. It would be the one Dorian Vance was about to start in the middle of town. Black Hollow sat at the junction of two unremarkable roads in the Wyoming Territory, the kind of place that existed because the land around it was useful. Good grazing, a decent river, timber close enough to haul without breaking your back entirely. It wasn't pretty. The buildings along Main Street were mostly weatherboard and wishful thinking, and the mud that accumulated between the general store and the livery stable was the particular shade of brown that suggested it contained things better left unidentified. But it was functional. It had commerce and a doctor and a church with a bell that actually rang, and that put it ahead of a dozen other settlements that had tried and failed to take root in the territory. The town ran on cattle and reputation, and both required management. The Vance Ranch, called simply the Vance Place, by those who'd been there long enough to have opinions about it, sat 8 miles northeast of town on a bench of land above the river. It was not the largest operation in the county, but it was by most measures the most respected. Dorian Vance had built it from 40 acres. His father left him in a borrowed note he'd spent 11 years paying back, and the story of how he'd survived the winter of 1878 alone. 3 months, 2 wolves that came after his horses, a fever that should have killed him, and a collapsed roof he'd repaired with nothing but salvaged timber, and a stubbornness that bordered on the pathological, had become the kind of frontier mythology that made younger men feel inadequate. I was 34 years old, 6 feet and a fraction, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from actual work rather than vanity. His face was weathered past what his age should have allowed, with deep-set gray eyes that tended to make people uncomfortable when he held their gaze too long, which he often did, not from aggression, but from a genuine habit of looking at things until he understood them. He had a scar that ran from his left jaw to just below his ear, origin story varying depending on who told it. He didn't talk about it himself. He'd never married. This had not gone unnoticed. The arrangement, as the town's better families had taken to calling it amongst themselves, had been quietly negotiated over the course of the preceding spring and summer. There were 5 families involved: the Aldercotts, the Morrisons, the Harpers, the Delacroix family from Cheyenne, who'd recently acquired land near the river, and old Silas Brandt, who had 3 daughters, and the disposition of a man who considered them inventory to be moved efficiently. The pitch, as delivered to Dorian over whiskey by Preston Aldercott, was straightforward. Vance was the most eligible man in a 100-mile radius. His ranch needed a mistress. The families had daughters, refined, educated, capable of managing a household and presenting well in company. A proper marriage would strengthen all the right alliances. Everyone benefited. Dorian had listened to the entire pitch without interrupting, which was his way. Then he'd said, "Set a date. I'll come look." Preston had taken this as enthusiasm. It was not enthusiasm. Fun. The day of what most of Black Hollow had taken to calling the presentation, a word they used with both excitement and faint embarrassment, like they knew how it sounded, fell on a Thursday in mid-October, 2 days after the first frost. The families had arranged it at the Aldercott house, which was the largest private residence in Black Hollow and the closest thing the town had to a statement of civic ambition. There was a parlor big enough to seat 14, a dining room with a genuine walnut table that had been hauled in at extraordinary expense, and curtains that Vera Aldercott changed seasonally and considered a point of personal pride. 5 women waited in that parlor with varying degrees of composure. Eleanor Morrison was 22, with copper hair pinned in careful ringlets and a dress that had clearly been ordered from somewhere with an actual dressmaker. She was pleasant-looking and educated and had spent the previous evening rehearsing things to say about ranch management and frontier life in a way that demonstrated both awareness and appropriate deference. Clara Harper was 25 and had the quiet confidence of a woman who'd been told she was beautiful often enough that she'd decided to believe it and act accordingly. She was not unkind, she was simply certain. Lisette Delacroix had come up from Cheyenne specifically for this and made sure everyone was aware of the inconvenience. She wore a traveling suit that probably cost more than Dorian's most recent equipment purchase and had opinions about everything, which she delivered in a precise, clipped voice that suggested she'd been educated somewhere back east. Adelaide Brandt, Silas's eldest, was 20 and terrified and hiding it behind a fixed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd been dressed by her father and given a list of topics to raise, and she clutched that list mentally, like a lifeline. The 5th woman, Ruth Comstock, a widow from the north end of the county, was the only one who seemed genuinely relaxed. She was 31, had run a household through a difficult marriage and come out of it with clear eyes and a practical turn of mind. And she was the only one who, when Dorian walked in and shook hands and accepted coffee, actually asked him a question that had nothing to do with herself. "What broke last winter?" she asked. "On the ranch. What broke that you couldn't fix right away?" Dorian had looked at her with the first real interest he'd shown. "The east fence line along the river, ice heave got under the posts. Took me 6 weeks to get it sorted properly because I kept patching instead of pulling and resetting." "That'll happen again," Ruth said. "I know," he said. "Oh, he stayed 3 hours. He was civil to all of them. He asked questions and answered them and ate the food that was offered and did not once behave with anything less than basic courtesy. Then he stood up, thanked everyone for their time, put on his coat, and left." Preston Aldercott followed him outside, certain there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps Dorian needed more time, perhaps he wanted private conversations, perhaps there was a preference he hadn't yet voiced. "Which one, Dorian?" Preston asked, and his voice carried the pressure of a man who'd made promises he couldn't unmake. "None of them," Dorian said. He said it the way another man might say, "The weather looks fair, factual, untroubled, already moving on to the next thought." Preston stood on the porch of his own house and watched Dorian Vance walk down his front path in the cold October light, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, completely powerless. The news spread through Black Hollow, the way all significant news did. Through the women first, then the merchants, then the men at the saloon, who picked it up last and acted like they'd known all along. The specific character of the gossip shifted depending on who was telling it. Preston Aldercott, when pressed, said Dorian had declined to make a selection at this time, and that the matter was under ongoing consideration. Vera Aldercott said he'd been rude. Ruth Comstock, when asked, said she thought he'd been perfectly polite, and that probably none of them were what he was actually looking for, which was a more honest assessment than anyone wanted to hear. Silas Brandt, who'd invested significant effort in Adelaide's presentation, said things about Dorian Vance that couldn't be repeated in mixed company. The younger men in town, the ones who'd half envied and half resented Dorian's standing for years, were quietly pleased in a way they didn't voice. Maribel arrived in Black Hollow on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after Dorian's departure from the Aldercott parlor, on the same stage that brought the mail and a shipment of window glass for the new hardware expansion. She was not the kind of person who arrived. She was the kind who appeared, sitting at the far end of the stage bench when the door opened, waiting until the other passengers had climbed out before she moved, taking her time because getting her frame out of the narrow coach door required patience and a certain willful ignorance of whoever might be watching. Several people were watching. She was heavy, substantially, visibly, in the way that people in 1883 Wyoming did not have the social vocabulary to discuss without simply staring. Her coat was dark wool, plain and serviceable, worn at the elbows. Her hair was brown and pinned back without art. Her face was round and unassuming, and she had the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time becoming very quiet in public spaces, Not timid exactly, but contained, compressed. She carried a single traveling case, scuffed leather, with a brass clasp that had been repaired with wire at some point. She set it down on the boardwalk and looked at Black Hollow with an expression that was careful not to reveal anything about what she thought of it, which was, privately, smaller than I expected, colder. Fine. She had a piece of paper with an address written on it, and she stood for a moment orienting herself before picking up her case and starting down the street. Two boys sitting on the rail outside the feed store watched her pass and said something to each other and laughed. She heard it. She walked. Her connection to Black Hollow was through her mother's cousin, a woman named Agnes Flint, who ran the town's only boarding house, Flint's Rooms, painted in faded letters above the door. With the efficiency of someone who'd never quite recovered from disappointment and had decided to make a career of managing other people's expectations. Agnes was in her 50s, raw-boned, with a face that had been severe in youth and had simply sharpened with age. She was not unkind to Mara. She was also not particularly warm. She opened the door, looked Mara over once in a way that took in everything and filed it, and said, "You're later than I thought you'd be. There's a room on the second floor. Stairs are in the back. Meals are at 6 and noon, not whenever you decide to come down." "Thank you, Agnes," Mara said. "Don't thank me yet," Agnes said, and went back inside. This was in the context of how Mara's life had generally gone, a perfectly acceptable beginning. She had come from Omaha, which was itself a departure from where she'd been raised, a farm outside a small town in eastern Nebraska that she did not miss. Her father had died when she was 14, leaving a wife who couldn't manage the land and two older brothers who could, but had no intention of sharing the proceeds with anyone they didn't have to. Mara had stayed longer than she should have, doing the work that kept the household functional, while her brothers took the credit for the farm's survival and treated her presence as an obligation they resented. She'd left at 24. Not dramatically, no screaming departure, no final confrontation. She'd simply packed what she could carry, left a note that said, "I've gone to Omaha," and taken the morning train. In Omaha, she'd worked. She was good at work, the kind of systematic, patient application of effort that other people often mistook for slowness, but which was actually thoroughness. She'd kept books for a dry goods merchant for 3 years. She'd managed inventory and correspondence, and the particular task of making a man who was terrible with numbers believe he was doing fine. She'd lived in a rented room and saved money, and generally tried not to require much from the world. The move to Black Hollow had been partially Agnes's invitation. "I have a room. There's work here if you're willing." And partially the feeling that Omaha had run its course. She was 28 years old. She did not have romantic illusions about Wyoming. She had arrived expecting to find work, manage her situation, and continue in the general direction she'd been heading, which was survival with a degree of dignity. She had not expected Black Hollow to notice her at all. She was wrong about that. By Saturday morning, she had been noticed by essentially everyone, which was the nature of small towns in the territory. A new face required immediate cataloging. The specific texture of how she was noticed varied. Esther Grady, who ran the supply store with her husband, was perfectly civil when Mara came in for thread and lamp oil and asked where she'd come from and what had brought her, which were reasonable questions. But Mara caught the look Esther exchanged with the other woman in the store. A fast, sideways look that communicated something without words. And Mara knew exactly what it communicated because she'd seen it 10,000 times before. The woman at the post office was less subtle. She watched Mara navigate through the door and said to the man beside her, in a voice pitched just above a whisper, "Good Lord, how'd she even get here on the stage?" And the man had laughed a quick, embarrassed laugh before catching Mara's expression and looking away. The boys from outside the feed store had apparently been replaced by a different set of boys, but with the same general approach to entertainment. Mara bought her thread and her lamp oil and walked back to Flint's rooms without hurrying. She put her purchases away, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of feeling whatever she felt. Then she stood up and thought about what she needed to do next. She'd been in town 4 days when Dorian Vance rode in on a Tuesday. He came alone, as he generally did, on a gray horse named Sutton, who had terrible opinions about dogs and expressed them loudly whenever one appeared. He tied up outside the general store, went in, conducted his business with Esther Grady in the focused, transactional way he had. He needed account books, he needed lamp oil in quantity, he needed information about a pending freight delivery, and then came back out. I was crossing the street toward the post office when he stopped. He stopped because he'd noticed something, which was what he did when something required understanding. He had a half-second visual impression that his mind then worked on. A woman sitting on the bench outside Flint's rooms, across and down the street, with a bowl in her lap that she appeared to be shelling beans into. Not remarkable, except that she was working with the particular efficiency of someone who'd been doing a task like that since childhood. The thumb finding the seam, the flick of the wrist, the rhythm of it. No wasted motion, no looking at her hands. She was looking up at the mountain line instead, with an expression he couldn't read from across the street. But that wasn't unhappy and wasn't performance. She was just looking at the mountains and shelling beans and apparently content to be doing exactly that. He stood there for probably 10 seconds, which for Dorian Vance was a long time to stand still. Then he crossed the rest of the street and kept walking. He heard about her from Ruth Comstock, who was the most straightforwardly honest person in Black Hollow and therefore the only one whose information he trusted. He'd run into Ruth at the post office, and they'd talked briefly. Ruth had no hard feelings about the parlor situation and found the whole thing mildly amusing in retrospect, and she'd mentioned in passing that Agnes Flint had a new boarder. "Came from Omaha," Ruth said. "She's a quiet one. Been helping Agnes with the mending, I heard. Agnes doesn't give anything away, which means the girl's actually useful." "What's her name?" Dorian asked. Ruth had looked at him with mild curiosity. Mara Bell." A pause. "She's the heavy woman. Came in on Friday's stage." "I know who you mean," Dorian said. Ruth studied him for a moment. "Why are you asking?" "Curious," he said. Ruth had known Dorian Vance for 6 years, and she had never once heard him describe himself as curious about a person. He was curious about fence posts and weather patterns and the causes of livestock disease. Not people. She watched him leave the post office and filed the exchange away. He didn't approach Mara that Tuesday. He had business, and he conducted it, and he rode back to the ranch. And that evening he sat by the fire with a cup of coffee and thought about what he actually needed. This was not a new line of thinking. He'd been having it, in various forms, for several years. The shape of it was this. The Vance Ranch was functional right now because Dorian was functional right now. He was 34 and healthy and capable of managing everything that needed managing. But the ranch was also, and this was the thought that kept coming back like a stone in a boot, fragile in a way that had nothing to do with weather or cattle prices or the reliability of hired help. It was fragile because it depended entirely on him. If he was injured, which had happened twice, seriously, the operation staggered. The winter of 1878 had not been a triumph of solitary heroism the way the town told it. It had been 3 months of incremental crisis management where everything went wrong at once, and he'd survived by the thinnest of margins and learned from it that survival alone was not a strategy. He needed a partner, not a wife in the ornamental sense, not a woman who could manage a parlor and attend social functions and produce children and be pleasant company at dinner. He had nothing against pleasant company, but he'd watched enough frontier marriages collapse or persist in grinding misery, because the woman involved had been chosen for her social fitness and then deployed into conditions that required something completely different. He'd sat in that Aldercott parlor and listened to 5 women, and all 5 of them had been talking to him about the ranch the way someone talks about a thing they intend to live around rather than within. Eleanor Morrison had asked about the social calendar in the county. Lizette Delacroix had mentioned that she assumed they would spend the winters in Cheyenne. Clara Harper had talked about redecorating what she'd heard was a fine main room. Adelaide had frozen when he asked her what she knew about cattle. Ruth had asked what broke. That was the closest anyone had come, and even Ruth, capable, clear-eyed Ruth, was looking for a life that would fit around an existing template she'd more or less figured out. He wasn't looking for that. He was looking for someone who would build something with him from the working end. The trouble was, he didn't know how you found that. It wasn't a thing you could ask in a parlor. He came back into town on Thursday. He told himself he had errands, and he did have errands. The account books needed dropping at the bank. There was a conversation to have with the farrier about Sutton's left rear shoe, but he was also aware, in the honest part of his mind, that he was looking for the woman who'd been shelling beans. He didn't see her immediately. He did his business. He had the conversation with the farrier. He was walking back toward the general store when he saw her coming out of the milliner's with a package wrapped in brown paper that was clearly a delivery she'd been sent on rather than a purchase of her own. She handed it off to a woman waiting on the boardwalk with the quick efficiency of someone completing a task. She turned, and for a moment she was standing maybe 30 feet from him, and he was standing still on the street looking at her. She noticed. People generally noticed when Dorian Vance was looking at them, because he didn't look away when caught. She met his gaze for a brief moment, and there was no flutter in it, no performance, just a direct, assessing look back, and then she nodded, the minimal nod of someone acknowledging a stranger, and started walking. He followed, not in a predatory way. He simply matched her general direction, which was back toward Flint's rooms, and closed the gap at a pace that brought him up beside her before she reached the next corner. "Miss Bell," he said. She stopped and turned. Up close, she was not what he'd half expected. He'd been around enough hard life to know that people who were mocked often developed either a flinching quality or an aggressive one. She had neither. She just looked at him with the same direct, waiting expression. "You know my name," she said. It wasn't hostile, it was just an observation about the available information. "Small town," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I'm Dorian Vance." "I know," she said. "People here talk about you more than they probably realize." A pause. "What do you want, Mr. Vance?" He almost said, "I'm not sure yet," which was the honest answer. Instead, he said, "To ask you something." "All right." He looked at her. "How'd you manage in Omaha? Work, I mean. What did you actually do?" Whatever she'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. Something shifted in her face. The careful containment relaxed by a fraction, replaced by something more genuine and somewhat wary. "I kept books," she said, "for a dry goods merchant, inventory, accounts receivable, correspondence." "Did he cheat people?" "Sometimes. I fixed it when I could." "Why?" "Because it was wrong," she said, in the tone of someone who considers this too obvious to require explanation. "And when you couldn't fix it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I found what I could actually change, and I changed that instead." Dorian nodded once, slowly. "What are you doing in Black Hollow?" "Looking for work. Agnes needed help." "Agnes need much help?" "Not nearly as much as she thinks I owe her," Mara said, and then caught herself, as if she'd said more than she intended. But Dorian almost smiled. "What kind of work are you looking for?" She studied him with the expression of someone running a rapid calculation. "The kind where I'm useful," she said. "I'm good at numbers. I'm good at organizing. I'm patient. I don't need to be thanked for things." She paused. "And I don't complain. But I do speak up when something's being done wrong." "That's a useful quality," he said. "Most people don't think so," she said flatly. "Most people are running operations where being told they're wrong is a threat," Dorian said. "I'm not." The silence between them was the kind that had weight in it. Not uncomfortable, but full. She was looking at him with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite interest, somewhere in between. "What are you actually asking me, Mr. Vance?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the honest answer after all. "But I'll know when I figure it out." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good afternoon, Miss Bell." He walked away. She watched him go. Her heart was doing something she didn't appreciate, which was beating slightly faster than the situation called for. She pressed her lips together and told it firmly to stop, and walked back to Flint's rooms, and didn't mention the conversation to Agnes when Agnes asked who she'd been talking to in the street. "Nobody," she said. Agnes gave her a look that said she didn't believe that at all. The announcement, if it could be called an announcement, happened 4 days later, and it happened the way most things Dorian did happened, without preamble and without apparent concern for its effect on the people around him. He came into Grady's Supply on Monday morning, and Preston Aldercott was there, and 3 other men, and Esther Grady behind the counter, and it was therefore an audience whether Dorian intended one or not. Preston, who had been nursing his grievance about the parlor situation and had recently been approached by Silas Brandt with urgent questions about what, exactly, had gone wrong, made the mistake of pressing the matter. "Dorian," he said, in the tone of a man who believes he's about to have a reasonable conversation, "I need to know what your intentions are. Those families are waiting. I gave them my word." "You gave them your word," Dorian said. "That's your problem, Preston." "It's a matter of respect," Preston said, his voice going stiff. "These are good families. The women deserved a straight answer, and they got one," Dorian said. "I'm not the right match for any of them." "Then what are you looking for?" Preston said, and it came out with more edge than he'd intended. Dorian set the items he was purchasing on the counter and looked at Esther. Add these to the account? Sure, Esther said, writing quickly. Dorian, Preston repeated. Dorian picked up his purchases and looked at Preston with the steady gray gaze that most people found exhausting to be on the receiving end of. I'm looking for a woman who can run a ranch, he said. Not manage a household, run an operation. There's a difference. Every woman at that gathering could have... I'm going to speak to Mara Bell, Dorian said. The room went very still. Esther's pen stopped moving. The woman at Agnes's, one of the other men said, slowly, as if confirming they were all thinking of the same person. Yes, Dorian said. Preston looked at him as if he'd announced an intention to shoe his horse backwards. Dorian, that woman is... she's... He stopped, apparently unable to identify which objection to lead with. She's what? Dorian asked. Quiet. Even. Preston chose the most practical-sounding objection. She's nothing. She's nobody. She has no family standing, no property, no connections here. I know, Dorian said. Anything else? The silence answered him. He nodded, picked up his things, and left. Esther Grady looked at the door he just walked out of for a long moment. Then she looked at Preston Aldercott, who was standing in the middle of her store with the expression of a man who's just lost a game he didn't know he was playing. Well, she said. By noon, Black Hollow knew. By dinner, the interpretations had multiplied. He was doing it out of spite for the Aldercott families. He was doing it because he'd lost his mind. He was doing it because there was something wrong with him that had previously gone undetected. He was doing it because the woman had money hidden somewhere, which was clearly ridiculous, but circulated nonetheless. Nobody considered the possibility that he simply meant what he'd said. At Flint's rooms, Agnes Flint learned about it from the butcher's wife, who had learned about it from the butcher, who had been in Grady's supply and heard the whole thing. Agnes came back to the boarding house, sat down at the kitchen table across from Mara, who was mending a pillowcase, and looked at her for a long moment. Dorian Vance told Preston Aldercott he intends to speak to you, Agnes said. Mara kept her eyes on the mending. Intends to speak to me about what? About marriage, apparently. The needle paused. For 3 full seconds, nothing moved. Then Mara said, carefully, And is that what he said? That he intends to speak to me? That's what the man who heard it says. Mara set the mending down in her lap. She was quiet for long enough that Agnes, who was not a patient woman, felt the need to fill the silence. He rejected 5 women, Mara. 5 women from the best families in this county. And now he's saying... Agnes stopped, started again. Do you know something I don't? Has he approached you privately? We spoke briefly, Mara said. In the street, a few days ago. About what? He asked about my work in Omaha. Agnes stared at her. He asked about your work. Yes. Agnes rubbed her face with both hands in the manner of someone seeking patience from a limited supply. Mara, you understand what this will look like to people. I know what it will look like, Mara said quietly. They'll say he's gone mad, or that you've done something. They'll say a great many things, Mara said. She picked the mending back up, found her place, and continued. The needle moved, in and out, in and out. People generally do. Agnes watched her for a moment. Aren't you surprised? Frightened? Mara considered the question seriously, which was her way with questions. I'm cautious, she said. I don't know what he wants. I don't know if he's serious. I don't know if his reasons are good ones. Those are the things that matter. And if his reasons are good? Agnes asked, softening slightly despite herself. Mara was quiet again. Outside, the wind had come up and was pushing at the window glass. Then I suppose I'll listen, she said. She didn't look up from the mending, but her jaw was set in a way that Agnes recognized. Not from Mara specifically, but from her own younger self, from women she'd known who'd made decisions in hard circumstances with whatever was available to them, and had stood by those decisions without flinching. Agnes got up and put the kettle on. It was the most comforting thing she knew how to do. The wind pushed harder against the glass. Somewhere out on the street, someone was laughing. Neither woman acknowledged it. The cold was deepening. The mountains to the north had gone white. And in Black Hollow, something was shifting. Subtle as a change in wind direction, significant as the difference between a season that kills and one that merely tests. Marabelle shelled beans and mended cloth and waited. She had learned, over 28 years of being exactly who she was, in a world that had very clear opinions about it, that you didn't move towards something uncertain until you understood its weight. She was beginning to understand. The question was whether she'd like what she found. He came on a Wednesday, which was not a day anyone expected anything significant to happen in Black Hollow. Mara was in the back of Flint's rooms beating dust from a rug she'd hung over the porch rail when she heard the horse. She didn't stop what she was doing. She finished the section she was on, set down the beater, and turned around, and there was Dorian Vance tying his gray horse to the post at the front gate with the unhurried manner of a man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. He saw her. He came around the side of the house. "Miss Bell," he said. "Mr. Vance," she said. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not ask what he wanted because she already had a reasonable guess, and she'd spent the last 4 days deciding how she felt about it. He stopped a polite distance away and looked at her directly. "I'd like to talk to you properly," he said. "If you're willing." "About what specifically?" "About the ranch," he said. "About what I'm looking for. And about whether any of it sounds like something you'd want." He paused. "I'm not here to ask you anything yet. I'm here to tell you the truth about the situation and let you decide if it's worth your time to hear more." She studied him. He stood still while she did it, which most people couldn't manage, but most people filled silence with something, movement or words or a performance of casualness. He just waited. "All right," she said. "Come in. I'll make coffee." Agnes Flint was in the front room and made no pretense of not being aware of Dorian's arrival. She gave him a look that contained an entire paragraph of opinion about the situation, said Mr. Vance in a tone that was technically civil, and disappeared into her sewing room with the door left 2 inches open. Mara noticed this and said nothing. She put the coffee on and sat down at the kitchen table across from Dorian and waited. He talked for nearly 40 minutes. He told her about the ranch, the actual state of it, not the version that circulated as town mythology. The east fence, the fact that he had 4 reliable hands and 2 who weren't reliable but were available. The cattle numbers, the debt structure that remained from the original purchase, the way the operation ran during good seasons versus the desperate improvisation of bad ones. He talked about the winter of 1878 in terms she'd never heard. Not the heroic version, but the real one, where he'd made 3 decisions under fever that should have killed his herd, where he'd survived by luck as much as skill, where he'd lain in his bunk one night in February, genuinely unsure if he was going to be alive by morning. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, when he paused. "Because if I were looking for someone to impress, I'd tell you the other version," he said. "And I'm not." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "What are you looking for?" "Someone who can run the books," he said. "Someone who can manage the hands when I can't. Someone who can make a decision when a decision needs making and doesn't need me to be in the room for it to be a good one." He looked at her steadily. "I've watched this ranch operate entirely around my presence for 11 years. That's a structure that works until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, everything goes at once. I need it to be able to function without me at the center of every single moving part." "That's a business arrangement," Mara said carefully. "It would also be a marriage," he said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That's what I'm proposing. A real one, not a convenience arrangement with separate lives." A pause. "But I'm also not going to stand in that Aldercott parlor and pick a woman for her curtain opinions. I've watched men do that. It doesn't end well." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence line with a sound like running water. "Why me?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I know you kept books for a man who was cheating people and you fixed it when you could," he said. "I know you left a situation that wasn't working without burning it down, which takes more patience than most people have. I know you sat on a bench in a town that's been rude to you since you arrived and shelled beans like you had nowhere better to be, which means you're either very calm or very good at looking like it." He paused. "I don't know which one yet, but I'd like to." The honesty of it landed on her like something physical. She'd expected flattery or pity or something performative, and this was none of those things. It was simply a man telling her what he saw and what he needed. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said, "and I want to see the ranch before I decide anything." He nodded. "Saturday. I'll come by at 8. He finished his coffee, thanked Agnes audibly enough that Agnes couldn't pretend she hadn't heard, and left. Mara sat at the table for a while after he was gone. She could hear Agnes in the sewing room, not sewing. The machine was silent. just sitting in there, waiting. Well, Agnes called finally. I'm going to look at the ranch Saturday, Mara said. A long pause. That man is either very serious or very strange, Agnes said. He might be both, Mara said. She got up and went back to finish the rug. The story was in town before dinner. Not from Mara, not from Dorian, but from a boy who'd been playing in the adjacent yard and had seen Dorian's gray horse tied at the gate of Flint's rooms for the better part of an hour. By the time it made its third retelling at the saloon that evening, Dorian had apparently been inside for 3 hours and had come out looking determined, and Mara had been seen smiling, which Mara had not in fact done at any point during the conversation, but which made the story better and so stuck to it. Preston Aldercott heard about it and sat down heavily in his desk chair and looked at the ceiling. Silas Brandt heard about it and said something that sent his youngest daughter out of the room in tears. Clara Harper, who was still in Black Hollow staying with cousins, heard about it and felt something that she privately identified as confused. She wasn't hurt exactly. She barely knew the man. But there was a particular indignity to being passed over for someone like that, and she didn't know what to do with the feeling, so she put it away and didn't take it out again until much later. The town talked. That was what it did. What the town talked about had a specific quality to it that Mara recognized from long experience. It was the talk of people who were trying to make sense of something that disturbed their established categories. She didn't fit the category of woman a man like Dorian Vance chose. Therefore, either Dorian had lost his judgment, or there was a hidden explanation that would, once revealed, restore the natural order. The two theories that emerged with the most persistence were that Dorian had some financial motive involving Mara's unknown resources, the hidden money theory, which was pure invention, and that he was doing it to embarrass the Aldercott families, which gave him a motive people could understand even if they didn't respect it. Nobody seriously entertained the third option, which was that he'd simply looked at her and seen something worth looking at. That option required the town to reconsider certain things about itself, and it wasn't ready to do that. Saturday came cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming morning that was beautiful in the way that reminded you beauty and comfort had nothing to do with each other. Dorian arrived at 8 with a second horse, a bay mare he called Lena, who was apparently patient with inexperienced riders, which he mentioned without making it sound like a concession. Mara had ridden before, enough to manage. She said so and mounted without requiring assistance, which she could see registered somewhere in Dorian's attention, though he didn't comment on it. They rode out of Black Hollow heading northeast, and the town watched from various windows with an intensity that Mara felt on the back of her neck like a second cold wind. The ranch was 8 miles. They covered it mostly in silence, which suited her. The landscape did its work on her without her permission. The wide bench of grassland above the river, the mountains going white against a blue so clean it almost hurt, the smell of sage and cold earth, and the particular dryness of high Wyoming air. She'd grown up in flat country. This did something to her that she didn't entirely have words for. The ranch itself was not what she expected. The main house was a log structure, solid and unadorned, with a porch that needed one board replaced, and a front door that had been repaired so many times in different materials that it had a sort of geological record of emergency. The barn was large and well kept, better kept than the house, she noted, which told her something about the man's priorities. 2 ranch hands were in the yard, and they watched her arrive with expressions carefully arranged to show nothing, which showed everything. Dorian walked her through all of it: the barn, the tack room, the small building he used for an office where the ledgers were kept in a state that made her hands itch. Not dishonest, just disorganized in the way of someone who understood numbers conceptually but not systematically. The winter grazing situation, the water source, the problem with the north pasture fence that he'd been managing rather than solving for 2 seasons. "Why haven't you fixed it properly?" she asked, looking at the fence in question. "Time and labor," he said. "I can't pull posts and reset them without pulling someone off something else, and there's always something else. If it goes another winter without being fixed, you'll lose the north pasture as functional grazing and you'll have to move cattle to the south field, which from the look of it is already running close to capacity." I was looking at her with something that wasn't surprise exactly, but was adjacent to it. "Yes," he said. "That's right. It's a priority problem," she said, "not a resource problem. You have the hands. You're using them on things that feel urgent instead of things that are important." A pause. The wind came across the pasture and pushed at them both. "Yes," he said again. She looked at the fence for another moment. Then she turned and looked at the house. Then she looked at the mountains. Then she looked at Dorian Vance, who was standing in the cold Wyoming air waiting for her verdict with the patience of a man who'd learned to wait on things he couldn't rush. "It's a good operation," she said. "It's not as solid as it looks from the outside, but it's fixable. Most of the problems are solvable with better systems." "And?" he said. She pulled her coat tighter. "And I want to be clear about what I would and wouldn't be agreeing to," she said. "If I said yes, which I haven't." "Go ahead," he said. "I'm not decorative," she said. "I know you know that, but I want to say it plainly. I won't become decorative later. I won't manage myself smaller because people in town are uncomfortable. I'll work, and I'll have opinions, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong, and if you want someone who defers on everything, I'm the wrong person." "I know," he said, "and I want to be clear that I'm not—" She stopped, chose her words. "I'm not under any illusion about why I've gotten this opportunity, and not others. I know what I look like. I know what people say. And I need to know that when things get hard, and things will get hard, you're not going to stand in front of a room full of people and find it inconvenient to have chosen me." It was the most direct she'd been. It cost her something to say it, which was evident in the set of her jaw, but she held his gaze. Dorian was quiet for long enough that the silence had mass. Then he said, "I've never backed away from a decision because it made people uncomfortable. If I had that particular weakness, I'd have married Eleanor Morrison on Thursday and saved everyone a month of gossip." He paused. "I picked you to talk to because of what I saw. What you look like isn't what I saw." "I know," she said, "but it's what everyone else sees." "I'm aware," he said, "and I'm not asking you to pretend that doesn't matter or that it won't be difficult. I'm asking you if you think this is worth the difficulty." She looked out at the north pasture fence, at the mountains, at the barn that was better kept than the house. "I'll tell you by Tuesday," she said. She told him on Monday. She came to find him, which required asking the general location of his ranch hands in town. One of them, a young man named Cal, who had a face like an unfinished thought, happened to be at the post office and looked at her with wide eyes when she asked him to pass a message to Dorian Vance that she'd like to speak with him. Cal delivered the message with a speed that suggested he'd run most of the way, and by the time Dorian came into town that afternoon, there were at least 6 people positioned at various windows with unnecessary business near the street. They met outside Flint's rooms again, on the porch. "Yes," she said. Dorian looked at her. "All right," he said. "We'll go to the judge next week." "All right," she said. They stood there for a moment in the way of 2 people who have just made a large decision and are both absorbing it. Then Mara said, "The north fence is the first thing we fix." And Dorian Vance, for the first time in the conversation, actually smiled, brief and a little crooked and entirely genuine. "Agreed," he said. The reaction from Black Hollow was not shock, exactly. The town had been expecting this since Wednesday's horse at the gate, but it had the quality of shock, the breathless outrage of people watching something happen that they'd been certain wasn't going to happen right up until it did. Preston Aldercott requested a private meeting with Dorian that Dorian declined with 4 words. "My mind is settled." Silas Brandt made noises about Dorian having lost his standing in the county, which Dorian absorbed without visible reaction. The Morrison family sent a letter from Cheyenne that was technically polite and communicated fury. Lizette Delacroix had already left Black Hollow by then and expressed her opinion through her father, who expressed it to anyone who would listen. For Mara, the town's response was not noisy. It was quieter and more persistent and in some ways worse. She felt it in the small calculations people made when she entered a space, the slight reorientation, the whispers timed to be almost inaudible. Women she'd been careful to be pleasant to looked through her in the street. The butcher's wife, who had previously been civil in a minimal way, had taken to pretending she simply didn't see Mara when they were in the same line of sight, which required visible effort. One afternoon, leaving the general store with a list of items she'd been asked to collect, she found the package she'd left briefly on the bench outside had been knocked into the mud. She couldn't prove it hadn't fallen. She picked it up, cleaned it off, and walked back to Flint's rooms without changing her expression. That night she sat in her room and was honest with herself about the weight of it, because she'd learned that not being honest with yourself about the weight of something was how you ended up crushed by it. It was going to be hard. It was going to be harder than she'd anticipated, which was saying something because she'd anticipated difficulty with clear eyes. But she'd made her decision based on what was real, not what was comfortable. The ranch was real. Dorian's assessment of his own situation was clear-eyed and honest in a way she hadn't encountered much. And the opportunity in front of her, to build something, to use what she actually had, to be in a situation where her judgment mattered, that was also real. She'd spent 28 years being told that who she was wasn't enough. She'd decided some time ago that the people doing the telling were wrong. She just hadn't yet been in a position to prove it. She was in that position now. The question was whether she'd hold. She already knew the answer. She'd known it since she was 14 years old, packing a bag in a house that didn't want her, and deciding that leaving quietly was not the same as leaving defeated. She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the wind come down off the mountains, and thought about fence posts and account books, and a man who'd smiled, really smiled, when she'd told him what needed fixing first. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something more angular than that, more practical. The kind of thing that doesn't break easily because it was never soft to begin with. She closed her eyes. Outside, Black Hollow settled into the particular silence of a cold night, the kind that pressed down on everything and made the world feel smaller and more dangerous than it was in daylight. She slept. They were married on a Thursday in November, in the judge's office, with Agnes Flint and Cal as witnesses. Cal because he happened to be standing nearby when Dorian needed a second name, and he'd said yes with the enthusiasm of someone who understood he was going to have a story to tell for the rest of his life. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The judge, a spare man named Horace Kemp, who had married and buried and arbitrated most of Black Hollow's significant moments with the same unhurried competence, read the words without embellishment. Dorian said what needed saying. Mara said what needed saying. Horace signed the paper and handed it over and said, "Good luck to you both," and meant it in the plain, unsentimental way of a man who had seen enough of life to know luck was not a small thing. Agnes had brought a small wrapped parcel, a quilt she'd made herself over the previous years, already broken in and warm, pressed into Mara's hands outside the office door. She didn't say much. She straightened the collar of Mara's coat and pressed her lips together and looked away at the mountain line, and Mara understood that this was Agnes doing the closest thing to tenderness she knew how to do. "Write me," Agnes said finally. "I will," Mara said. They moved to the ranch that same afternoon. The first weeks had the texture of two people learning the specific grammar of living in close quarters with someone they didn't yet know entirely. Not bad, not romantic, not what either of them had perhaps imagined in whatever private imaginings they'd permitted themselves. It was practical and occasionally awkward and punctuated by moments of unexpected ease. Dorian made coffee that was too strong and didn't understand why this was worth mentioning. Mara reorganized the office ledgers in the first 3 days, which Dorian accepted without comment, but Cal witnessed with an expression of pure reverence, because the ledgers had been a source of quiet misery for everyone involved in managing them. She learned the ranch by walking it. Every morning in the gray pre-dawn, she was up before Dorian. Not to prove anything, but because she'd always been an early riser and stillness in the morning was when she thought most clearly. She'd pull on her coat and boots and walk a different section each day, not covering ground for its own sake, but observing, where the water pooled after rain, where the cattle tended to drift, which sections of fence were holding and which were held together by optimism. She kept a notebook. Dorian found her making notations in it one evening by the fire and asked what she was writing. "A map," she said, "of problems in order of cost if ignored." He looked at it. It was organized in a way that took what he knew intuitively and arranged it into something that could be communicated, acted on, prioritized. He sat with it longer than she expected. "The east water line," he said, pointing. "Third priority," she said. "It'll hold through spring, but not next summer. Fix the fence first, then the east line before May." "Cal's not going to like the fence project," he said. "Cal will be fine," she said. "He works harder when he knows why something matters. Explain it to him instead of just assigning it." Dorian looked up at her. "You've known him 3 weeks." "I've been watching," she said. "It was not perfect. Nothing about it was perfect. There were moments where the gap between what they were building and what they didn't yet have showed clearly. Evenings where the silence was not the comfortable kind, but the kind that exists when two people haven't yet found the words for something, or aren't sure if finding them is safe. There were moments where Mara felt the specific loneliness of being in a new place with new people and a new name, and having to perform competence every single day because she couldn't afford a single significant mistake. Not here, not now, not while the town was watching for exactly that. She didn't tell Dorian about all of it. Some of it she kept, the way you keep a sore in your mouth that you know will heal if you leave it alone. But the town did watch. That part she hadn't overestimated. The first significant incident came 5 weeks in, on a trip to Black Hollow for supplies. She'd come alone. Dorian had work that couldn't be left, and she was capable of driving a wagon, which she'd made clear early on, and which he'd accepted without the cautious negotiation she'd half expected. She drove in, tied up at Grady's, went in with her list. Vera Aldercott was there, and Catherine Brandt, Silas's wife, and two women Mara knew by face but not name. They were arranged in the way of women who hadn't planned to be there together but had recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. Mara said good morning. Vera returned it with something technically in the vicinity of a greeting. Catherine looked past her in the practiced way Mara had come to recognize as deliberate. She was working through her list with Esther Grady when she heard Catherine say, from across the room, in a voice calibrated to carry, "I heard she's reorganized the whole operation, moved things around without asking anyone." A pause. Then Vera, same calibration. "Well, a woman like that has to make herself useful somehow." Esther's hands went still on the counter. She looked at Mara with something that was either sympathy or apology. Mara couldn't tell which. Mara finished reading the item on her list. 2 pounds of the dried beans as well, she said to Esther. The navy ones, if you have them. Esther got the beans. Mara paid, packed her goods, and left. Outside, loading the wagon, her hands were entirely steady. This was a thing she'd learned, that the body could perform competence while the interior did something else, and that the performance was itself a kind of protection. She drove back to the ranch and unloaded the supplies and made dinner and didn't mention any of it. That night Dorian said, "How was town?" "Fine," she said. "Cold coming." "Yeah," he said, looking out the window. "I know." She didn't know if he'd heard anything. He probably had. Small towns had ways of routing information to the people it was most about. But he didn't press it, and she didn't offer it, and they both understood, in the unspoken negotiation of people learning to live with each other, that some things were being laid down in the foundation of this marriage, and some of them weren't comfortable, and some of them were necessary, and there was no clean way to separate one from the other. The second incident was worse. 3 days before the first real snowstorm of the season, Mara drove in again for a final supply run before the weather made travel uncertain. She'd left the wagon in front of Grady's and gone across to the post office for the ranch's mail, and when she came back the wagon had been moved. Not far, just enough that the wheel was on the wrong side of the ice rut at the edge of the road. She didn't know if it had been deliberate. She couldn't prove it. But when she tried to correct the position, the wheel caught, and the whole wagon lurched, and a third of the supplies she'd already loaded shifted, and 2 of the sacks fell into the road mud. She stood there in the cold looking at the situation. A group of men outside the saloon across the street were watching with the very specific quality of attention that suggested they'd seen it happen and found it satisfying. She did not look at them. She went around to the wheel, assessed the angle, adjusted what she could adjust, got back up, and made the correction with 3-point maneuvering that took longer than it should have but eventually worked. She climbed down, picked up the fallen sacks, packed them back in, wiped her hands on her coat, and drove out of Black Hollow. She was halfway back to the ranch before she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the incident itself, but the accumulation of incidents. The daily calculation of performing normality in a space that was actively hostile to her presence. The loneliness of knowing that if she reacted it would be used against her, and if she didn't react it would continue, and there was no version of this that was fair. She cried some, on the road, which was fine because no one could see her and the horses didn't care. Not the collapsed kind of crying, but the functional kind, the kind that releases pressure that has no other outlet. By the time she reached the ranch gate, she was done, face dry and cold from the wind, and she came in and put the supplies away and was entirely functional by the time Dorian came in from the north fence. He looked at her once in that way he had, that long, assessing look, and she could see him register something, but she'd beaten him to it. "The north posts," she said, before he could speak. "How many did Cal pull today?" He watched her for a moment. 6, he said. "We need 12 before the ground freezes hard," she said. "Can he get 6 more tomorrow?" "Probably," Dorian said, still watching her. "Good," she said, and turned back to the stove. He let it go. She didn't know if that was the right call on his part. Sometimes she wanted him to push through the door she was holding shut, and sometimes she was grateful he didn't. The complexity of that was something she hadn't anticipated about marriage. Not the conflict, but the ambiguity. The moments where she couldn't tell what she actually needed. November deepened. The storm came in the third week and was significant enough to keep everyone on the ranch for 4 days straight. The kind of storm that reminded the territory of what it could do when it stopped holding back. The hands slept in the barn by the second night to keep the temperature stable for the horses. Mara cooked for all of them, which was a task, and kept the supply inventory updated, and fixed the one window that the wind had been working loose for the previous month with a matter-of-factness that Cal watched with visible admiration. It was during the storm, the second night of it, while Dorian was out checking the barn and the hands were all accounted for, and the house was as settled as it was going to get, that Mara sat down at the office desk and opened the ledgers and found something that had been sitting in the numbers all along, waiting to be seen. She'd been reorganizing the records since she arrived, moving from the current year backward through previous seasons, and she'd noticed irregularities, small ones, the kind that didn't announce themselves but accumulated in the way of water-finding cracks. Payments to a supplier listed as Garrett and Sons that appeared in the books going back 4 years, but that she couldn't cross-reference to any actual supply delivery she could account for. Not large amounts, individually, but regular and consistent. She pulled 2 years' worth of records and laid them out on the desk and spent an hour being certain she wasn't misreading something, because she'd learned that the first responsibility of anyone working with numbers was to eliminate their own error before they accused anyone else's. She wasn't misreading it. Someone had been pulling money out of the Vance operation systematically, under a supplier name that appeared legitimate at a glance and didn't at a closer one. Not enough to cripple the ranch in any single year. Enough that over 4 years it had contributed meaningfully to the financial pressure Dorian described as the chronic condition of the operation. Always functional, never quite comfortable. She heard the door. Dorian came in stamping snow from his boots, face reddened from the wind, and she said, from the office doorway, "Can you come in here?" It wasn't a question. He heard the tone of it and came. She showed him. She walked him through it methodically. The entries, the cross-references, the absence of matching deliveries, the total when you added 4 years together. She could see the moment he understood what he was looking at. His face went very still. "Garrett and Sons," he said. "There's no Garrett and Sons supplier in any of the delivery records," she said. "Not one. I went back through every receipt I could find. Who's been handling the accounts? Before me?" She paused. The records show it was managed by a man named Tipton, Richard Tipton. Dorian's jaw set. "Tipton handles accounts for half the operations in this county," he said, in the flat voice of someone absorbing information that has larger implications than the specific thing in front of them. "I know," Mara said. "Which means if this is happening in your books, the probability is significant that it's happening in others." Silence. The storm pushed at the house. The fire cracked and settled. "How much?" Dorian said. Not a question. She told him the number. He put both hands flat on the desk and stared at the ledger page for a long time. 4 years, he said. "At minimum," she said. "I haven't gone further back yet." "Don't," he said. Then after a moment, "No, do. I need to know the full number." "I'll have it by morning," she said. He straightened up, looked at her. "How did you find it?" "I was looking for something else," she said. "The East Waterline cost projections. I was comparing current supplier rates to historical ones, and the Garrett entries didn't match anything I could verify, so I kept pulling." A pause. "I almost missed it. It was designed to be missed." "By someone who knew the accounts well enough to hide things in them," Dorian said. "Yes," she said. Another silence. He was doing the thing he did when he was thinking hard, which was going very still. Not frozen, processing. "Tipton is friends with Aldercott," he said. "I thought that might be relevant," Mara said carefully. He looked at her. "You thought that before you showed me." "I wanted the numbers to be complete before I said it," she said. "I didn't want to be the person who found a financial irregularity and immediately pointed at a name without being certain." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite respect, but was close to both. "All right," he said. He picked up the lamp. "Get some sleep. You said morning." "I'll have it by morning," she said again. He nodded and paused in the doorway. "Mara." She looked up. "Good work," he said, the same way he'd say it to Cal after a good day on the fence. Simple, direct, without embellishment. She'd been praised before. She'd been thanked. But this specific quality of recognition, The acknowledgement that she'd done something technically difficult, and had done it correctly, and that this mattered, landed differently than she expected. She turned back to the ledgers. Outside, the storm was still going. In town, 8 miles away, Richard Tipton was presumably warm and comfortable and entirely unaware that a woman he'd never spoken to had just spent an evening dismantling 4 years of careful concealment with nothing but patience and a lamp and a refusal to stop pulling the thread. She went further back. She went all the way back to where the record started. The number she gave Dorian at 6 in the morning, over coffee that was too strong as always, was larger than either of them had expected. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "It's not just Tipton," he said finally. "No," she said. "The pattern changes in the earlier years, different entries, different amounts. Someone else was involved, or Tipton had a partner who dropped out." "Aldecott," Dorian said. Not a question this time, a conclusion. Mara said nothing. The fire was low and needed feeding, and she got up and added wood and waited. "This is going to be a problem," Dorian said. "Aldecott has influence in this county going back 20 years. I start making accusations." "You don't make accusations," Mara said. "You present documentation to someone whose judgment can't be questioned." "Which means Judge Kemp," he said. "Which means Judge Kemp," she agreed. Dorian drank his coffee. "The storm breaks tomorrow," he said. "Day after, I'll ride in." "We'll ride in," Mara said. He looked at her. "I found it," she said. "I know the books. If there are questions about the records, you need me there to answer them." A beat. "You know what that means," he said. "Being in that room, Aldecott will be—" "I know what it means," she said. He held her gaze. Then he nodded once, the same nod he'd given when she told him what to fix first on the ranch. A decision made and moved past. The storm blew itself out by the following evening, leaving Black Hollow buried under 14 inches, and a silence so complete you could hear the snow settling. The mountains were white to the tree line. The air tasted like iron. And in the Vance ranch house, in the office, with the newly organized ledgers and the lamp burning low, Mara Bell, Mara Vance now, though the name still sat slightly foreign in her mind, stacked the records she'd need into a careful order, wrapped them in oilcloth against the weather, and set them on the shelf by the door, ready for morning. They rode into Black Hollow 2 days after the storm broke. In the early morning, when the snow was still blue-gray in the shadow of the buildings, and the horse's breath came out in long white plumes, Mara had the oilcloth-wrapped ledgers in the saddlebag. Dorian rode with the particular set to his shoulders that she'd come to recognize as his version of preparation. Not tense exactly, but gathered. Like a man who has made his decision about a thing and is now simply executing it. Judge Kemp received them in his office at the back of the courthouse, a room that smelled of paper and wood stove and old coffee, with a desk covered in the organized disorder of a man who knew where everything was and didn't want anyone else to touch it. He was already at work when they came in, and he looked at them over his glasses with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned that the nature of unexpected early morning visits was usually significant. "Dorian," he said. Then, with the same weight, "Mrs. Vance." It was the first time anyone in an official capacity had called her that. It landed somewhere in her chest in a way she hadn't prepared for, and she kept her expression level. "Horace," Dorian said, "we have something you need to see." He didn't preamble. Neither did Mara. She unwrapped the ledgers and laid them out on the only clear surface available, which was the chair beside the desk, and she walked Kemp through what she'd found in the same methodical sequence she'd used with Dorian, starting with what the book showed, moving to what the delivery records didn't show, arriving at the Garrett and Sons entries and the total and the years involved and the shift in pattern in the earlier records that suggested more than one hand. Kemp listened without interrupting. He was the kind of man who listened the same way regardless of who was speaking. The same quality of attention, no visible tells about what he thought while you were still talking. When Mara finished, he sat with it for a moment. "Tipton's been handling accounts for at least a dozen operations in this county," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "You're suggesting this isn't limited to the Vance Ranch." "I'm suggesting the probability is low that it is," she said. "I can only document what I have access to. But the structure of it, the way it's embedded, the way the entries are formatted, that's not something you design for one target." Kemp looked at Dorian. "And Aldecott." "The early records," Dorian said. "The pattern changes. She found it." "I can show you the specific entries," Mara said. Kemp held up one hand, not dismissively, but in the way of someone who needed to think before he looked at more. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the snow-covered street for a moment. Preston Aldercott has been on the County Land Commission for 16 years, he said. He has relationships with the Territorial Administrator's office. You understand what it means to bring this? I understand, Dorian said. If the documentation doesn't hold, it holds, Mara said. Kemp turned and looked at her directly. It was the look of a man taking a proper measure of someone, not unkind, but thorough. How certain are you? Certain enough to be in this room, she said. I don't make accusations I can't support. There's a reason I walked through every receipt I could locate before I said any of this to Dorian, and a reason I went back to the earliest records before we came to you. If there's an innocent explanation for the Garrett entries, I want to know what it is. I haven't found one. Another silence. The wood stove ticked. Leave the ledgers, Kemp said. I'll need 3 days. Don't speak about this to anyone. Agreed, Dorian said. They rode back to the ranch in the same silence they'd ridden in with, though a different kind. The weight of it was settled now, committed. Whatever was going to happen was in motion and couldn't be unmade. Halfway back, Dorian said, without looking at her, You did well in there. He's a fair man, she said. It helps when the person you're talking to is actually listening. Not everyone listens to you like that, Dorian said. She knew he was aware of what had been happening in town. She'd understood from early on that he heard more than he appeared to. Not because people kept him informed, but because he paid attention in the way of someone who'd spent years being the only decision-maker in a situation and had learned to read the available information. No, she said. Not everyone does. He nodded. Nothing more. It was enough. The 3 days that followed had the quality of held breath. Mara worked. The accounts, the inventory for the coming weeks, the assessment she'd been building of which suppliers were giving fair pricing and which weren't. Cal fixed the last of the north fence posts in weather cold enough that he had to stop every 20 minutes to warm his hands, and she brought coffee out to him in the middle of the afternoon, which seemed to confuse him in a way that he didn't know how to process. You don't have to do that, he said, wrapping both hands around the cup. I know, she said. How's the ground? Hard, he said, but not impossible. We'll finish tomorrow. Good, she said, and walked back to the house. She heard him say something behind her quietly, to no one in particular. She didn't catch the words, but the tone was the same one her youngest brother had used on the rare occasions he'd been genuinely grateful for something. The embarrassed warmth of a young man who didn't quite know what to do with a feeling. On the third evening, a rider came from town with a note from Judge Kemp that said only, Come in the morning, both of you. They came. The judge's office had acquired an additional presence, a man named Aldous Webb, who was the county sheriff, sitting in the corner chair with the expression of someone who had already heard something that had rearranged his morning. Kemp laid it out. He had spent 3 days cross-referencing Mara's documentation against the county's own land commission records and the bank ledgers he had authority to access, and what he'd found was not smaller than what she'd presented. It was larger. Richard Tipton had been running the same fraudulent supplier scheme across 9 ranch operations in the county. The total across all accounts was significant enough that Kemp read the number twice to make sure it registered. And the earlier pattern Mara had identified in the Vance ledgers, the different hand, the different structure, traced to a period when Aldercott had been directly managing Tipton's introduction to 3 of those 9 operations, in a sequence that was difficult to explain as coincidence. Aldercott's direct involvement is harder to prove, Kemp said. The documentation is thinner there, but Tipton's is not thin. Tipton's is comprehensive. Then we start with Tipton, Dorian said. That was already my intention, Kemp said. He looked at Mara. I want you to know that your organization of these records made this possible in a time frame that would otherwise have taken weeks. Tipton is careful. The concealment was designed for someone who was only looking at 1 year at a time. I know, she said. That's why it worked for 4 years. Webb, from his corner, said, Mrs. Vance, is this the entirety of the documentation you found? For the Vance Ranch, yes, she said. I don't have access to other ranches' books. No, he said. Of course not. A pause. You ever do this kind of work before? The forensic accounting. I didn't have a name for it before, she said. But yes. He nodded slowly. All right. They left the courthouse into the cold morning street, and Dorian held the door for her, and as she stepped out, she nearly walked into Preston Aldercott. It was the particular bad luck of small towns that made it happen. Aldercott was on his way into the courthouse for something unrelated, a land registration matter, and he pulled up short when he saw Dorian and then absorbed Mara's presence beside him, and then registered the courthouse door behind them, and then, in the space of 2 or 3 seconds, put enough of it together to understand that something had shifted. His face went through several expressions before it settled on the careful blankness of a man buying time. "Dorian," he said. "Preston," Dorian said. A beat of silence in the cold street. "Mrs. Vance," Aldercott said, and managed to make the courtesy sound like something being performed under duress. "Mr. Aldercott," Mara said. He looked at Dorian for a moment longer, reading whatever he could from the closed surface of Dorian's expression, which was giving nothing. Then he went inside and the door closed behind him, and Dorian and Mara walked to their horses without speaking. It was when they were 2 miles out of town, in the open country between the tree line and the river, that they heard the gunshot. It came from behind them, from the direction of town, single and sharp in the cold air. They both pulled up. Mara turned in the saddle. "That was close," she said. "Too close for hunting," Dorian said. They looked at each other. They turned back. It was not Aldercott. It was one of the men associated with Tipton, a hired hand named Cress, who'd apparently been kept apprised of the situation by someone, and had made a very bad decision about how to respond to it. He'd fired in the direction of Sheriff Webb as Webb was leaving the courthouse. Missed, badly, as it turned out, the kind of miss that suggested panic rather than intent, and had then attempted to ride out of town and been pulled off his horse by 2 men who'd seen it happen. Nobody was shot. The horse had thrown a shoe in the commotion, which was the most significant physical casualty of the event. But Cress, in the subsequent conversation with Webb, that was neither voluntary nor comfortable, said enough about who he was working for and what he'd been told that Webb had the additional documentation he needed to make the Tipton matter unambiguous. Dorian and Mara arrived back at the edge of town in time to see the aftermath. People in the street, the specific quality of cluster that meant something had happened, and everyone was still deciding what it meant. Cal was there, having been in town for feed, looking white around the eyes. "You're all right," Cal said, seeing them, with a relief that went well past the professional. "We're fine," Dorian said. "What happened?" Cal told them. Dorian listened, and Mara listened, and she watched Dorian's face cycle through something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief, but contained elements of both. She felt it herself, the retroactive fear, the understanding of how quickly things can move from administrative to physical, the recognition that she'd set something in motion by finding those numbers, and that the consequences had a momentum of their own now. Webb came over, still carrying the particular energy of a man who'd recently been shot at, and was managing his response to that. "Tipton's in custody," he said, without preamble. "Cress, too, which is going to make things considerably faster." He looked at them. "You should both go home. I'll send word when I need you." "Is it going to hold?" Dorian asked. "It'll hold," Webb said. Cress opened his mouth enough to give us Tipton clearly. Tipton's not going to hold up under questioning. He's not built for it. And once Tipton talks, Aldercott's situation becomes considerably less ambiguous. He walked away. Mara watched him go and then looked at the street, at the faces of the people who had gathered. She recognized most of them at this point. Esther Grady, Hetty Prush from the house with the marigolds, 2 of the men who'd been outside the saloon the day the wagon wheel had stuck, Ruth Comstock, who had seen them arrive and was standing apart from the general cluster with an expression that was measuring rather than reactive. Their eyes met. Ruth nodded, the same minimal nod Mara had given Dorian that first day in the street. Mara returned it. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet and cold, and it wasn't until they were inside with the horses put up and the fire going that either of them spoke about anything beyond the immediate practicalities. Dorian was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee cup he hadn't drunk from, looking at the middle distance, and Mara was at the stove, and he said, "I want to tell you something." She turned. "I knew things weren't adding up in the accounts," he said. "Not specifically. I didn't know what was wrong, but I knew the numbers never quite made sense for the operation we were running. I told myself it was my management, that I was missing something in how I ran things." He looked up at her. "I've been blaming myself for this operation being harder than it should be for 4 years, and it was Tipton." She heard what he was actually saying underneath the words. The specific damage of it, not the money, but the 4 years of believing the shortfall was his own fault. "You couldn't have found it the way it was organized," she said. "It was designed to look like normal variation." "I know," he said. "But I should have had someone looking. I kept thinking I'd deal with the accounts later, when there was time, and there was never time. There's never time, she said. That's how those things work. They happen in the spaces where there's never time. He looked at her for a moment. I'm glad you found it. I know, she said. She turned back to the stove. They weren't the kind of people who piled additional language on top of a thing that had already been said clearly, and that particular quality of their marriage, the shared economy of words, was something she'd come to value without having expected to. But she stayed aware, as she made dinner, that something had shifted between them in the previous week, in the discovery, in the courthouse meeting, in the ride back under gunshot, in this conversation. The structure of their partnership had been theoretical for the first weeks. Now it had been tested, partially, and had held. That was different from theory. That was evidence. She thought about what Dorian had said in the cold pasture that first day, about wanting a ranch that didn't depend entirely on him. She thought about the look on Kemp's face when he'd said her organization of the records had made the investigation possible in a time frame that mattered. She hadn't saved the ranch yet. There was still the matter of Aldercott, which Webb had said would come, and the question of what recovery looked like for the operations that had been paying into Tipton's scheme for years, and the ongoing reality of a town that was processing all of this and trying to fit it into existing categories and failing. But she had found the thing. She had looked at numbers until they told the truth, and then she had carried that truth into a room full of people with the authority to act on it. And she had not flinched or softened or deferred. That was enough for tonight. Cal knocked on the door after dinner with a question about the morning's work, and she answered it while Dorian worked on the lamp that had been flickering for a week. And outside the Wyoming night pressed in cold and enormous. And somewhere 8 miles away, Richard Tipton was sitting in a room thinking about the decision he'd made to believe that no one would ever look closely enough at the numbers. He'd been wrong about that. He'd been wrong because he'd assumed that the person who eventually looked would be someone like himself. Someone with standing in the town, with connections, with a reason to be careful about which truths they chased and which they let lie. He'd never considered the possibility that it would be a woman everyone had laughed at on her first day in Black Hollow, sitting alone at a desk in a lamp-lit office with a notebook and a patience that did not run out. That was, in the end, the specific nature of his error, and it was going to cost him everything. Richard Tipton lasted 4 days before he talked. Sheriff Webb had predicted it. He's not built for it, he'd said, and he was right in the specific way that men who have spent years in careful concealment are often not built for the moment the concealment ends. Tipton had constructed his fraud on the assumption that it would never be directly confronted, and when it was, the architecture of his composure had nothing underneath it. On the 4th day, he asked for paper and wrote down everything, which was both more and less than Webb had expected. More names, more operations, more years, and less actual remorse than a man confessing to that scale of theft might reasonably be expected to show. Webb sent word to the ranch on a Friday morning. The note was brief. Tipton gave us Aldercott. Come Monday, if you can. Dorian read it at the kitchen table and passed it to Mara without comment. She read it and set it down and finished her coffee. Aldercott will have a lawyer by now, she said. He's had a lawyer since Wednesday, Dorian said. Preston's not slow. It won't be enough, she said. If Tipton documented it as carefully as he documented everything else, there won't be enough lawyering in Wyoming territory to make the numbers say something different than what they say. She was right, as it turned out. But the process of being right took longer and was uglier than the simple fact of rightness suggested. The Monday meeting was not just Dorian and Mara and Webb. It was 9 ranchers, the operators of the other operations Tipton had been running the scheme through, and their representatives, and in 2 cases their lawyers, gathered in the large room at the back of the courthouse that was normally used for land hearings. Judge Kemp presided. The territorial administrator had sent a representative from Cheyenne, a man named Forsyth, who wore a good coat and had the careful neutrality of someone whose job was to assess damage rather than feel it. Mara sat at Dorian's left. She was the only woman in the room. She had understood, walking in, that this was going to be a specific kind of difficult, not the quiet hostility of the street or the performed blindness of the store, but the more complicated discomfort of men in a formal setting being required to take direction from documentation that a woman had produced. She'd prepared for it by being prepared, which was the only preparation that actually worked. She had the complete ledger analysis organized and the order questions would most likely arise. She knew every number in it without having to look, and she had decided before she walked through the door that she would answer every question put to her directly and without apology, and would not soften her certainty to make anyone more comfortable. The first challenge came from a rancher named Gus Holloway, a large red-faced man from the north of the county who had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the loudest voice in any room. He looked at Mara's documentation for approximately 40 seconds before he looked up and said, to Dorian rather than to Mara, "How do we know this analysis is sound? Who verified it?" "Judge Kemp verified it," Dorian said, "over 3 days." "I'd like to hear from the person who produced it," Kemp said, from the head of the table, in the mild tone that meant the discussion was going in the direction he'd decided it was going. "Mrs. Vance, walk Mr. Holloway through the Garrett and Sons entries and explain how you identified the pattern." She walked him through it. She kept her voice even and her language precise, because precision was its own authority in a room full of men who were looking for reasons to discount her. She watched Holloway's expression change as she talked, not warming exactly, but shifting from active resistance to the reluctant attention of a man who is recognizing that the thing being said is correct. When she finished, Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You found all this in how long?" "The pattern became clear within the first 2 weeks," she said. "The complete documentation took longer because I went back to the earliest available records." 2 weeks, he said. "I was also managing the household accounts and the supply inventory," she said, without emphasis. "Just information." Something crossed Holloway's face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite admiration. He looked down at the papers in front of him and didn't raise another objection for the rest of the meeting. The Aldercott portion was the most contested. Preston's lawyer, a sharp, thin man from Cheyenne named Garfield, who'd clearly been briefed thoroughly, argued that the connection between Aldercott and Tipton in the early records was circumstantial, that introducing a supplier to a colleague's accounting operation was not evidence of fraud, and that without Tipton's testimony being independently corroborated, it was inadmissible as a basis for any formal proceeding. Kemp listened to this with patience. Then he said, "Mr. Garfield, the Territorial Land Commission records for the period in question show that Mr. Aldercott personally certified 4 supply contracts, including one with Garrett and Sons, on behalf of ranchers who were not present at the certification. Can you explain that?" Garfield could not explain it. He tried, with the professional composure of a man who has been in worse situations, but the explanation had nowhere to go because the records said what they said, and Kemp had them, and Forsyth from Cheyenne was writing things down in a notebook with increasing speed. Preston Aldercott sat through all of it. 2 chairs from his lawyer, with the expression of a man watching something collapse from a distance he'd believed was safe. He did not look at Dorian. He looked at Mara once, a single, brief look that she met and held, and then he looked at the table and did not look up again. By the end of the meeting, Forsyth had enough to open a formal territorial investigation. Tipton's scheme was documented comprehensively across 9 operations. Aldercott's involvement was substantiated sufficiently for the investigation to include him. The total amount of money that had been extracted from the county's ranching operations over the full period was enough that several of the men in that room had to sit with it for a moment before they could speak again. Webb said he'd be in touch with each operation about the process of recovery, which would be partial and slow and complicated, because that was the nature of it. The meeting ended. The men filed out with the particular silence of people who have absorbed too much information to process it conversationally yet. Dorian and Mara were among the last to leave. In the doorway, Forsyth fell into step beside them and said quietly, "Mrs. Vance, the Territorial Administrator's Office may want to speak with you about the methodology you used here for other investigations." She looked at him. "I'm a ranch operator," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "The offer stands." She didn't answer, and they walked out into the cold. Preston Aldercott's formal removal from the County Land Commission happened 6 weeks later, in January, after the territorial investigation had run its initial phase and produced enough documentation to make his position untenable. He didn't fight it publicly. Whatever fight he had left, he was apparently reserving for the legal proceedings, which Garfield was managing with the grim efficiency of someone billing by the hour and aware the hours were going to be extensive. The town's response to all of it was complicated in the way that small towns are always complicated when their hierarchies turn out to have been built on something rotten. There was anger, genuine anger, at Tipton, who had been trusted and had stolen systematically from people who couldn't afford it. There was the more uncomfortable anger directed at Aldercott, which carried the additional weight of having to admit that the man they'd deferred to for 16 years had been using that deference in ways they hadn't examined. And underneath both of those, quieter and more difficult, was the specific discomfort of having to acknowledge the source, that it had been found not by the sheriff or the judge or any of the men with standing and authority, but by a woman who'd arrived in Black Hollow 4 months ago on a stagecoach with a scuffed bag and no connections, whom most of them had written off before she'd unpacked. That particular reckoning happened at different speeds for different people. Esther Grady was among the first. She came to the ranch on a Saturday in January with a jar of preserved plums and a directness that Mara had always respected in her, even when Esther's directness had been uncomfortable. She sat at the kitchen table and said, "I was unkind to you. Not in ways I can point to exactly, but in ways I knew I was being." A pause. "I'm sorry for it." Mara poured her coffee and said, "I know." "That's all?" Esther said. "What else would you like me to say?" Mara asked, without sharpness. "Just a question." Esther thought about it. "Nothing, I suppose." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "You're not what I expected." "People rarely are," Mara said. They drank their coffee. It wasn't a transformation. Esther didn't leave as a different person than she'd arrived, and Mara didn't feel the specific warmth of vindication she might have expected to feel. What she felt was something flatter and more durable than vindication, something closer to the satisfaction of a problem that has been correctly solved. Gus Holloway sent a note, not an apology exactly, more a statement of professional respect that used the word sound, as in your analysis was sound, which from a man like Holloway was approximately equivalent to prostration. Ruth Comstock simply showed up one afternoon and helped Mara rehang the kitchen door that had been sticking since October. And they talked about weather and cattle prices and the comparative merits of different approaches to winter feed management, and at no point did either of them make direct reference to the preceding 4 months, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The harder conversation was with Cal. He'd been with the ranch 3 years when Mara arrived, and his adjustment to her presence had been genuine, but not without friction. There had been moments in the first weeks when she'd asked him to do something in a particular way, and he'd done it the other way, not out of defiance, but out of the habit of doing things as Dorian had always asked for them. She'd corrected him twice directly, and he'd bristled both times, and the third time she'd shown him why her method was more efficient, rather than just asserting that it was. And something had shifted. He'd become, over the months, one of the most reliable things about the operation. Not just in the physical work, but in his growing understanding that the ranch was being run by two people, and that this was an improvement over how it had been run by one. In February, after a hard day fixing the east water line that had finally needed the attention she'd predicted, he sat on the porch steps drinking water and said, without looking at her, "When I first heard Mr. Vance was bringing a wife out from town, I thought it was going to be a disaster, someone who'd want things changed for the wrong reasons." "That's a reasonable thing to have thought," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "About the disaster part," she said. "Things did change." "Yeah," he said, "but for the right reasons." He finally looked at her. "I just wanted to say I know that. That's all." She nodded. He went back to work. She stood on the porch for a moment after he'd gone, looking at the north fence line, fully repaired now, the posts set properly, the wire clean and tight, and at the mountains beyond it, white and enormous and indifferent in the way that the territory's landscape was always indifferent, asking nothing from the people who lived under it except that they be equal to it. She was beginning to believe she was. The east waterline repair opened up an issue with the adjacent drainage that cost them 2 weeks of additional work in temperatures that made everything miserable. The partial recovery of stolen funds from Tipton's assets, once the legal process reached that stage, returned less than half of what had been taken, which was better than nothing and worse than fair, which was the general nature of financial restitution in the territory. 2 of the ranch hands left for different work in the spring and had to be replaced, and the replacements were a mixed result. One capable, one less so, and the less capable one had to be let go in June with the particular discomfort of a decision that affected someone's livelihood. The ranch did not transform. That was the thing Mara had understood from the beginning that turned out to be true. The operational reality of the Vance place was not going to be resolved by a single discovery, or a single good season, or a single decision. It was going to be built, incrementally, by the accumulation of better choices made consistently over time. That was unglamorous. It was also the only thing that worked. By spring, she had reorganized the complete accounting structure. established relationships with 3 suppliers who offered better terms than the ones Tipton had been certifying, and identified 2 additional inefficiencies in the grazing rotation that, corrected, improved the South pasture productivity enough to cover the labor cost of the hands twice over. Dorian noticed all of it. He was not the kind of man who narrated his noticing, but she'd learned to read the specific ways he demonstrated it. The way he deferred to her judgment on financial questions without requiring the working to be explained. The way he brought her into conversations with other ranchers rather than summarizing them to her afterward. The way he'd started coming to her with problems rather than solutions, and seemed to find this natural. One evening in April, after a long day and a dinner that was adequate rather than good because she was tired and had made it without effort, he said, "You were right about Holloway's grazing schedule. He's going to lose the southwest section by August if he doesn't move the herd." "I told you that in February," she said. "I know," he said. "I should have pressed him harder." "He wouldn't have listened in February," she said. "He might listen now." "Should I tell him, or should you?" he said. She looked up from the table. It was a simple question on the surface. Underneath it was the acknowledgement that either of them could have the conversation with equal legitimacy, that her standing in the practical community of the county had shifted to where this was now a genuine choice rather than a foregone conclusion. "You tell him," she said, "but bring the numbers I put together. Show him the comparison between the south pasture trajectory and the southwest current rate." "All right," he said. She went back to what she was reading. After a moment he said, "Mara." She looked up again. He was looking at her across the table with the gray eyes that had made her uncomfortable the first time they'd looked at her directly, and now just looked like Dorian. Familiar and slightly exhausting and honest in the way of someone who never bothered being anything else. "I want to say something without making it sound like more or less than it is," he said. "Go ahead," she said. "When I came to find you in Black Hollow, I had a theory," he said, "about what I needed and what would work and what I was looking for. And I was right about some of it, but I was also guessing." A pause. "I want you to know that what you've actually done here, who you've actually been, is better than the theory. And I know I don't say things like that." She held his gaze. "You don't," she said. "So," he said, and stopped. Not because he'd run out of words, but because the word "so" was apparently doing all the remaining work. She understood him. After 6 months of living with a man who communicated in the negative space between statements as much as in the statements themselves, she'd learned his language well enough that so at the end of that particular sentence meant, "And I wanted to say it once clearly so you'd know." "Thank you," she said, also simply. He nodded. They both went back to what they were doing. It wasn't the conversation that people write poems about. It wasn't the kind of declaration that makes for easy stories. But it was true, which was something they had both decided early on was worth more than elegance. She thought sometimes, in the quiet of the morning or on the long rides to the north pasture, about what her life had been before. The Nebraska farm, the Omaha ledger books, the rented room, the accumulated years of performing smallness in spaces that expected it. She didn't think about it with bitterness, because bitterness was a thing she'd noticed required constant maintenance, and she didn't have the time. She thought about it with the level assessment of someone who has traveled a distance and can now see clearly how far they've come. She had been a woman that Black Hollow laughed at. She was now a woman that Black Hollow brought its account books to, not all of it, not the people whose need to maintain their categories was stronger than their need for good information, but enough of it. Holloway came in March with a ledger problem. Ruth sent 2 of her neighbors. Esther's husband asked about the supplier relationships she'd established, and whether the terms could be shared. She helped them all. Not from generosity in the sentimental sense, but from the practical understanding that the health of the surrounding operations affected the county's overall stability, which affected the Vance Ranch, which affected everything she was building. It was not selfless, but it was not unkind. The story that circulated about Dorian and Mara Vance, about the man who'd rejected 5 fine women and chosen the heavy woman everyone laughed at, and about what had come of it, had the quality that certain true stories develop over time, where the facts remain accurate, but the framing around them shifts as people understand what the facts actually mean. It stopped being a story about Dorian's eccentricity. It stopped being a story about a surprising choice. It became a story about what happens when you look at something the world has decided not to look at, and what you might find there if you're honest enough to see it. That wasn't a comfortable story for Black Hollow to carry, because it asked something of everyone who heard it. It asked them to consider what else they'd decided not to look at, what else they'd passed over because the container didn't match their expectations. Some people found that question valuable. Some people avoided the story entirely for exactly that reason. Mara didn't have strong feelings about which they chose. She was busy. By the following October, 1 year from the first frost that had come 3 weeks early, and found her sitting on a bench in a hostile town, shelling beans into a bowl. The north fence was solid, the east waterline was fixed, the accounts were clean, the south pasture was performing at capacity, and the Vance Ranch had turned a margin that Dorian had not seen in its 11-year history. Not a large margin, not a comfortable one. The territory didn't deal in comfortable margins. There was always something coming, weather or price or equipment failure or the ordinary disasters of keeping animals alive through Wyoming winters. But it was real. It was documented. It was earned. She sat on the porch that October evening in a coat that was warmer than last year's, watching the light leave the mountains in the particular way it did in that country. Not gradually, but in a series of sudden surrenders, the peaks giving up the last gold and going to gray, and then to the dark blue of high-altitude dusk. And she thought about nothing specific, just sat with it. The fence line, the mountains, the sound of the horses in the barn, and Cal somewhere in the yard doing something with the water trough that involved more noise than it should have. Dorian came out and sat in the other chair, the one she'd asked him to repair 3 months ago, and that he'd gotten to in August, which was fast for him. "Cold tonight," he said. "Yes," she said. They sat. The dark came down. "Same time next year," he said after a while. Meaning the accounts, the grazing rotation, the annual assessment she'd established as a fixed practice. "Same time next year," she said. She didn't need to look at him to know the expression on his face. She knew it the way you know a landscape after you've walked it enough times. Not perfectly, not without the possibility of surprise, but well, the way you know something real. That was what they'd built. Not a legend, not a fairy tale, not the story Black Hollow would make of it in the retelling, just a thing that worked. Two people who'd made a clear-eyed decision and had then done the sustained, unglamorous work of making it true. The stars came out over Wyoming, indifferent and countless and cold. The wind came down from the north the way it always did, carrying the smell of coming weather. She pulled her coat tighter and didn't go inside. She was exactly where she'd decided to be.